Thank you, Professor Vladeck. All right, our next speaker will be speaking about stopping corporate power and money in politics. He is the president of Public Citizen, a group that you have heard about and you will hear again today. He's been leading Public Citizen since 2009, where he is now spearheading the effort to loosen the chokehold that corporations and the wealthy have over our democracy. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, he established the Democracy is for People program, which is a project of Public Citizen, and it's specifically intended to fight for a constitutional amendment to overturn the ruling and curb money in politics. Please welcome Robert Weissman.
So thank you for your stamina for democracy, for breaking through power. Fortunately or otherwise, I'm the last person between you and lunch. So try to amuse you. Unfortunately, this microphone is taped down and I can't walk around and I don't have any pictures. So I'm just going to talk. But I was suggesting to someone that maybe we could entertain a little bit with some shadow puppets because of the good light. We have the people. And we have the Koch brothers pounding on the people. We'll come back to that puppet metaphor later on. So there's a story of conventional wisdom, which is that America is a country deeply divided. We're red and blue states. I heard some detailed reporting on this on NPR this morning with some actually interesting reporting and some shocking views. We're plainly a country divided profoundly by race and equally as profoundly and less often recognized by class. And I'd say that political story, that's the dominant narrative to try to explain what's going on in the country, that we're a divided nation. And it has some truth. That story has some truth. That's why it works. But it overshadows another story that is at least as important, I think probably more important, which is that we're actually an amazingly united country when it comes to the policy agenda that Americans favor. Astoundingly united. So I'm about to read you a set of statistics, but by way of background, compare them to the fact that 4 out of 5 people agree that the Earth revolves around the sun. So that's a marker. And it's not that's as an aside, Claire, that's not nothing to do with American science teaching. It's cross-culturally true. That's about the number when you look across countries. However, 83% of Americans think that the top 1% have too much power and have used it for economic advantage. 3/4 of Americans favor a steep rise in the minimum wage. By about 2 to 1, people oppose corporate trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The vast majority of Americans favor breaking up the big banks. About 9 in 10 say we need stronger financial regulation. 4 out of 5 voters favor expanding Social Security, not protecting it, not defending it, not stopping cutbacks, but expanding Social Security. By 3 to 1 margins, Americans want to close corporate tax loopholes. The president's controversial Clean Power Plan is favored by a 2 to 1, a small 2 to 1 margin. 3 out of 4 Americans favor stricter air pollution standards. The Clean Water Act has 80% support. If you give people the completely ridiculous and misleading choice between environmental protection and cost to the economy, 59% say they want stronger environmental protections. More than 9 in 10 Americans want origin of labeling, country of origin labeling for meat. 83% of Americans favor giving Medicare the right to negotiate drug prices. More Republicans rate drug prices as a higher, Republicans rate high drug prices as a higher level concern than Obamacare. They're more concerned about drug prices, Republicans, not the country, than Obamacare. Almost 9 in 10 Americans say that we should have tougher enforcement of law and regulations that apply to corporations. So there is an amazing consensus in the country behind a progressive populist agenda. There's also, as David, Michael, and others were saying, amazing lack of progress on that agenda. So there's this huge disconnect between what Americans want by overwhelming numbers and what we get. What do we get out of Congress? What do we get out of the executive? What do we get in the states? out of city councils. And you can't explain that adequately, in my view, with anything other than looking at the power of corporations and especially the power of the corporate class in our elections. So corporate political power is not only expressed through money in politics, but that's the cutting edge. And the problem long precedes, of course, the Citizens United decision that Oliver was talking about in 2010, but it got a lot worse with that decision. That decision held that corporations have the right to spend whatever they want to influence election outcomes. Most of you probably are not in the business of reading Supreme Court decisions, but if you want to pick one, although it's a long one, it's worth reading Citizens United because it is astounding, and even though it's got some law stuff in there, you'll understand immediately why it's astounding. It's predicated on the idea that the First Amendment protects the right of oppressed people, oppressed classes, to express themselves. And you read the majority opinion from Justice Kennedy about this connection between the First Amendment and the right of the oppressed, and it's eloquent and moving until you recognize that the oppressed class he's talking about is the corporate class, and that he's worried about the right of DuPont and Exxon and Walmart to speak out and not be unfairly discriminated against. And that's why we got Citizens United. We got another decision later on that sort of deepened it, and a couple others. And what it stands for, this right of corporations to spend whatever they want, but what it has enabled is a Wild West era in campaign spending. And so the world has become the political world has become materially worse since that 2010 decision. In 2012, there's about $6.5 billion spent on federal elections, which was a huge record. And you get these records, right? It becomes numbing. So this year we're going to smash that for sure. Those numbers totally undercount how much is actually being spent for a variety of reasons. The advertising business says that they tallied $9.4 billion in spending on political matters in the 2012 election cycle, and they expect to get almost approach $12 billion this year. That itself would be an undercount. So the amounts involved are just extraordinary. And what are the impacts? Most of the things that follow from this are familiar to people, but actually how bad it is maybe not be completely obvious. One thing that's long been the case is that the need to fundraise for political candidates means they spend their time with rich people, and that affects what they think and what they say and what they do. President Obama may have spoken and written about it more eloquently than anybody prior to Citizens United in his book Audacity of Hope. He's saying, well, he's running for Senate, what was he doing? Increasingly, I found myself spending time with people of means, law firm partners, investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists. As a rule, they were smart, interesting people. They were knowledgeable about public policy, but they reflected almost uniformly the views of their class. And he says, and I started to think the way they thought because I was hanging out with them all the time. Just more precisely, if you sort of look in the 2012 election, the New York Times reported right at the end of the election that the President Obama had attended twice as many fundraisers in the course of the election as he had attended campaign rallies. And that Mitt Romney sort of disappeared for long periods, only doing an event a day because he was so busy fundraising. And if you wonder what happened to Hillary Clinton in the August period, part of it was a strategy to sort of see if Trump could just sort of shoot himself in the foot or head every day. Didn't work out perfectly, unfortunately. But a lot of it was that she was spending all her time fundraising. So where was she? Like if you had friends in Los Angeles or San Francisco, they'd tell you the traffic was messed up every day because Clinton was riding around going to fundraisers. It's kind of funny. But even all this, so that's sort of what happens to the candidates. But the money that we talk about is worse than it seems at first glance because the money doesn't just get spread out equally. It gets focused in the most competitive races. And what we now have is all this outside money, the super PAC money and this so-called dark money that Citizens United enabled and spurred along, coming in at astounding numbers. There's $1 billion in 2012, and it'll be way more this year. But it gets really focused in the races that are tight. So in the tight Senate races, most of the time, the outside spending groups spend more than the candidates themselves. So they get to decide what really is being debated and discussed. They spend almost all of their money on negative ads. Everybody hates negative ads, but they work. That's why people use them. The candidates are a little bit deterred from using negative ads because they can be held accountable. But these outside groups, American Future Fund, whatever, Americans, whatever, Colbert's, parody was, is indistinguishable from the real thing, Americans for a Better Tomorrow tomorrow. The outside groups spend 85 to 90% of their money on attack ads, and that becomes what the races are about. So the state of the political dialogue is meaningfully degraded. And then, of course, we have a lot of that money coming in the form of secret spending and dark money, which means you can't even trace where the money is coming from. So the one thing you might be able to do to hold the groups accountable is identify who the funder is. But when all the funders are secret, you can't do it. So the vast majority, you hear these numbers the Koch brothers were going to raise almost $1 billion. They scaled that down because they don't like Trump so much. But they're going to spend easily $500 million through their network. You won't see the Koch brothers anywhere that near money. You know, they'll come in for a couple $1 million in disclosed spending. And all the money they're pouring in is going through groups that don't actually report. We do have some rules still in the books about campaign finance, but they're not enforced and they're honored in the breach. As the former chair of the Federal Election Commission will tell you, anyone's free to break the rules, she says, because there is no enforcement from the enforcement agency. Super PACs are not supposed to coordinate with candidates. No one thinks that doesn't happen. They used to say it was a wink and a nod, but maybe now it's a nod or something because the wink is gone. I mean, they're out and out coordinating. Money sloshes around between different organizations so you can't follow and track what went from whom to where. And then thanks to another Supreme Court decision in 2014, the McCutcheon decision, you can put together these strings of political committees and make it possible for individuals to donate directly huge amounts of money to candidates, up to $3 million. You may remember there was a huge fundraiser that was controversial during the Democratic primary that George Clooney hosted for Hillary Clinton. And to sort of get a good seat at that fundraiser, you had to contribute $300,000. And it's worth asking, why could anybody contribute $300,000 if the maximum contribution in a primary is like $2,700? That's because the Supreme Court said, well, you can string all this money together, you compile all these committees, and you write one check, and it's all fine. So stuff is really honored in the breach. That's kind of like, I think, sort of the lay of the land of some of the key elements of this, but some of the consequences maybe aren't sufficiently recognized. I think there's two that I think are sort of dominant. And they're sort of obvious, but maybe less obvious than it first appears. The first one is that all this money that's coming in, it's provided by an incredibly small number of individuals and corporations. It makes sense to sort of think about them together as a corporate class, like a really, really small number. So I would say that Occupy Wall Street, which did a great service to the country, kind of got it wrong, right? All this discussion about the 1%, right? The other 99, 1%. That doesn't explain what's going on in campaign funding. If you talk about, we need to talk about the top 0.01% to get any insight into what's happening. So the top 0.01% take about 4% of national income. It's about 30,000 people, something like that. They provide 40% of all campaign contributions. Top 0.01%. Even that actually undersells the stories. If you look at super PACs as sort of the cutting edge or the worst stuff, you're really looking at about 100 people from election to election who dominate what's going on. Usually the top 100 donors are responsible for about 3/4 of the super PAC money. In 2012, there were 52 people or families who gave more than $1 million to super PACs. This year, we're already at 100. So I guess the benchmark for being taken seriously rises. Not surprisingly, these people are overwhelmingly male. People of color don't have this kind of wealth. So almost all of these giant contributions come from white people. The other thing that's really underappreciated is the extent to which all this money controls what's debated. So if we connect back to that long list of things that Americans agree on, they're mostly not even talked about, or they're not talked about as much as they should be given the consensus in the country. And they're not talked about because that interest doesn't line up with I'm like Rudy Giuliani here getting a cell phone call, sorry. That interest doesn't line up with the donor class interest. And the politicians have to be responsive to the donor class to be taken seriously. So at the end of the day, the donors decide effectively who runs, they have a huge influence over who wins, They have a giant influence over what's debated, what's even raised as serious political conversation. Then, of course, after the election, what's going to be talked about seriously in Congress. So what do we have to do about it? Well, the policy agenda is pretty straightforward, and Americans don't have any disagreement about that. Just like all those other numbers, Americans are completely consensus on the need for far-reaching reform. Depending on what poll you look at, it's between 80 to 10 and 90 to 10 who want reform. The New York Times had a remarkable poll that said the country is split not over the need for reform, but whether the system needs fundamental change or to be completely rebuilt. I'm not actually sure which is the more radical one of those two, but that's basically, everybody agrees on one of those two things. Nobody agrees that the current system is fine or even needs small changes. And the changes that we need are familiar. So the small bore thing is to have disclosure. Everything should be, all the money, outside money, direct contributions, all of it has to be disclosed. You just have to end this sort of silliness of secret money dominating our elections. We need to have a system of public financing for our public elections. There's good systems in New York and elsewhere that show us how to do that. And we have to overturn Citizens United and other Supreme Court decisions that both entrench this ludicrous notion that corporations should have the same rights as people to affect our elections, but also make it possible to have all this outside spending. The good news is that Americans completely agree on that agenda. But we know from the first part of the conversation that agreeing on the agenda isn't enough. People have to get mobilized on it. And people actually, since Citizens United, have been. And we've had a change in what the conversation is on money and politics from kind of a boring good government thing to a fundamental democracy issue, a corporate power issue, and understanding the connection between the money and politics issue and corporate power and everything else that the whole agenda that Americans want to see realized. So just using the constitutional amendment as a marker, we went from 2 senators who supported an amendment in 2010 when the idea was thought to be either frivolous or too extreme, to 26 in 2012 when it started to gain traction. We had 54 US senators voting for a constitutional amendment, remarkably, in 2014. One of the presidential candidates now says that she would introduce an amendment within the first 100 days of taking office, and it's a core part of the agenda for the Democratic Party, remarkably. So we haven't broken through yet all the way to win. This used to be a bipartisan issue. Mitch McConnell has stopped that, but it will be again in the near future. The total key to winning is mobilizing, right? The polls are insufficient. Everything is about showing there's passion and that people care. This past spring, we had the first large demonstration around democracy issues in a generation, the first by money and politics maybe ever in Washington, D.C., with 5,000 people turning out to support the agenda that I just talked about, as well as a broader democracy agenda focusing on the crucial issue of voting rights as well. That was a good, small first step. We have to be at least an order of magnitude bigger, with people literally laying down in the streets to make a difference. That's what we have to do to win, and we have to win on this issue to win everything else that's being talked about at this conference. We're talking about breaking through power. This is really a central issue for breaking through power. Last thing to say is, okay, how do you get connected? If you don't yet know the website for a public citizen, you really should. It's citizen.org. Please sign up for our email list. We will send you a lot of fundraisers, but we'll also send you a ton of information about things you can do. And if you actually care to be really involved in organizing and want to get you hooked up with the on-the-ground organizing that's going on across the country in these red states and in the blue states to win this fundamental democracy reform. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Robert Weissman. We are now ready to break for lunch. Just wanted to say a couple of words. If anybody or everybody, hopefully, likes what you hear today, many of our speakers have written books. They are available for sale in the lobby outside. So make sure to check them out at the table that's set up out there. You have several options for lunch around here. If you go out the door on P Street and you take a left, head towards 17th Street and take a right on 17th. There are a few options down there. maybe more options available if you come out the front door here on P Street and take a right, go toward 14th Street. There is a Whole Foods down there. You know, I don't know if kale is officially passé, but if it's not, they have an excellent salad bar at Whole Foods, and I recommend their very garlicky kale salad. And then there's a bunch of options up there on 14th Street. So we're going to be starting again at 1:20 sharp, so everybody get back. The students who are here from Hood College, there is a box lunch available for you, so please congregate out in the lobby room. Thank you very much.